The first time they destroyed my mailbox, I honestly thought it was an accident. The fifth time, I was standing in my kitchen, staring out the window, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes earlier, wondering whether two grown women could actually be that careless or if they were doing it on purpose. 3 weeks later, one of their luxury SUVs was sitting in the middle of the street with both airbags deployed, steam pouring out from under the hood, and the answer became crystal clear. My name is Ethan Parker. I'm 39 years old, a structural engineer, and until all this happened, I was probably the least dramatic guy on Willow Creek Lane, a quiet neighborhood outside Franklin, Tennessee. Most of us kept to ourselves. We waved when we mowed our lawns, exchanged Christmas cookies once a year, and pretended not to notice when somebody's teenager came home after curfew. It was the kind of neighborhood where people argued about fertilizer brands, not lawsuits. Then the Hartwell sisters moved in next door. Madison and Brooke Hartwell were local real estate agents who had done very well for themselves. They bought the largest house on the street, a massive stone-front place with columns out front that looked like it belonged in a gated community somewhere in Florida. They arrived with matching luxury SUVs, matching designer sunglasses, matching little dogs that barked at everything, and matching personalities that somehow managed to fill an entire block. The first few weeks seemed normal enough. They smiled, introduced themselves, told everyone how excited they were to join the neighborhood. But pretty quickly, little things started happening. They parked partially in front of other people's driveways. They ignored stop signs. They treated every conversation like a business negotiation they intended to win. My mailbox sat close to the edge of the road, near the property line between our houses. It wasn't unusual. It was exactly where the county survey required it to be. Just a simple wooden post with a dark green mailbox attached to the top. Nothing fancy. One rainy Tuesday morning I walked outside and found it shattered. Pieces of wood were scattered across the ditch, and a stack of insurance paperwork was soaked through with muddy water. I figured somebody slid during the storm. It happens. I spent $40 replacing it and moved on with my life. Then it happened again. This time there hadn't been any rain. No ice. No weather at all. Just a beautiful sunny afternoon, followed by another destroyed mailbox. When I walked around inspecting the damage, I noticed white paint scraped along one side of the broken post. The Hartwell sisters both drove white SUVs. I remember standing there staring at that paint transfer and thinking, nah, that can't be enough to accuse somebody. So I let it go. A few days later, I happened to be outside trimming some shrubs when Madison backed out of her driveway. Fast. Way too fast. She clipped the curb, jerked the wheel, and barely missed my replacement mailbox. Then she laughed. Actually laughed. Not nervous laughter. Not embarrassed laughter. The kind of laugh somebody makes when they think the rules don't apply to them. That's when a little voice in my head started paying attention. The third mailbox lasted 11 days. I know because I checked the receipt afterward. 11 days. I came home from work and found it snapped clean off at the base. This time I took photos. Lots of photos. Close-ups. Wide shots. Tire tracks. Measurements. Timestamps. Maybe that's the engineer in me. Maybe it's because I was getting tired of spending money on the same problem over and over. Either way, I started building a file. A few of my neighbors noticed. One evening, my next-door neighbor on the other side, an older retired teacher named Walter, wandered over while I was taking pictures. He looked at the broken post and shook his head. "That's number 3, isn't it?" he asked. "Yep." He glanced toward the Hartwell house. Funny how it only happens on this side of the street. Then he walked away without saying another word. That comment stayed with me. Number 4 happened less than 2 weeks later. By then I wasn't even angry anymore. I was exhausted. Every time I repaired it, they acted like nothing happened. No apology. No conversation. No note on the door. Nothing. The thing that bothered me most wasn't the money. It was the disrespect. You know that feeling when somebody keeps crossing a line because they assume you'll never push back? That's what it felt like. Like I had become part of the scenery. An inconvenience. Something they could run over and ignore. Then came mailbox number 5. I still remember that morning perfectly. I stepped outside before sunrise, saw another pile of broken wood in the ditch, and just stood there staring at it. No anger. No yelling. Just silence. Because something had changed inside me. Up until that moment, Every repair had been about replacing what they broke. But standing there in the cool morning air, looking at the latest wreckage, I realized I was asking the wrong question. The question wasn't how many times I could replace a mailbox. The question was why I kept assuming people would eventually do the right thing when all evidence suggested otherwise. That afternoon, I opened my laptop and started researching. Local codes, federal regulations, postal requirements, roadside installation standards. Hours turned into days. The more I read, the more interesting things became. Because buried inside all those regulations was something I hadn't expected to find. There was a perfectly legal way to make sure nobody ever destroyed my mailbox again. And the moment I understood it, I stopped being frustrated and started planning. Planning is probably the part nobody talks about in stories like this because it isn't dramatic. There are no explosions, no arguments, no triumphant music playing in the background. It's just a guy sitting at a desk late at night, reading regulations while everybody else is asleep. But looking back, that was the moment everything changed. The more I researched, the more I realized that most people assume something is illegal simply because it seems unusual. What I discovered was that there was a huge difference between building a trap and building something durable. One was obviously illegal. The other was completely acceptable if it met the proper standards. So I did what engineers do. I started calling experts. I spoke with county officials. Y contacta a contracto prime trusta. I even spent an afternoon talking with a retired inspector who seemed genuinely entertained by the entire situation. After listening to my explanation, he chuckled and said, "Son, if somebody keeps driving into the same stationary object, eventually that's not a mailbox problem." That line stuck with me. A week later, I hired a contractor named Greg Lawson. Greg was one of those old-school builders who looked like he'd spent 50 years arguing with concrete and winning every time. He came out to inspect the location, listened to the entire story, then looked over at the Hartwell house. Madison happened to be unloading shopping bags from her SUV at that exact moment. She slammed her door, nearly hit a decorative planter, and didn't even notice. Greg watched for about 10 seconds before turning back toward me. "How many times did you say they hit it?" "5. He nodded slowly. "That's impressive in a really bad way." Then we started discussing options. What we eventually designed wasn't flashy. In fact, the whole point was for it to look completely ordinary. From the street, nobody would notice anything different. Same mailbox, same color, same location, same general appearance. But beneath the decorative exterior was something far more substantial. A reinforced core anchored deep into the ground. Solid, stable, built to withstand weather, time, and apparently terrible driving habits. Construction day arrived on a Thursday morning. Greg's crew showed up around 8 o'clock. They worked efficiently, pouring concrete, setting anchors, checking measurements. By lunchtime, the structure was already taking shape. I remember standing in my driveway, watching them finish the final details when Brooke drove by. She slowed her SUV, rolled down the window, and smiled. "Getting another mailbox?" she asked. "Looks that way," I said. "Hope this one lasts longer." She laughed. Not a friendly laugh. More like somebody making a private joke. Then she drove off. Greg looked at me after she left. "That one hit it too?" "Yep." He nodded toward the new installation. "Well, good luck to her." 3 days later, I was making breakfast when I heard a sound that didn't belong. Anybody who's worked around construction equipment knows what I mean. Different materials make different noises. Wood snapping sound one way. Metal bending sounds another. What I heard that morning was not the familiar crack of another mailbox being destroyed. It was something heavier, sharper, a violent crunch followed by absolute silence. I set down my coffee and walked toward the front window. For a second, I genuinely couldn't process what I was seeing. Madison's SUV was sitting crooked in the roadway at an awkward angle. The front bumper looked folded inward. Steam drifted from beneath the hood. One airbag hung limp against the windshield while another filled the driver's side with white powder residue. Meanwhile, the mailbox looked untouched. Not damaged, not leaning, not cracked, just standing there exactly where it had been 10 seconds earlier. I stepped outside. A few neighbors were already emerging from their homes. Madison sat behind the wheel, staring forward in disbelief. Her driver's door finally swung open and she climbed out. The moment she saw me, her expression changed from shock to fury. "What the hell did you do?" she yelled. I glanced at the mailbox, then at the SUV, then back at her. "Nothing. It's been sitting there the whole time." "You rigged it." "No, you set a trap. A trap usually moves." My mailbox was stationary. Her face turned red. "I'm going to sue you." I remember feeling surprisingly calm. Maybe because I knew exactly what had been built. Maybe because I'd spent weeks documenting everything. Or maybe because after 5 destroyed mailboxes, I simply ran out of frustration. Whatever the reason, I just pulled out my phone and called the police. By the time the responding officer arrived, half the street was watching. The officer examined the scene, took statements, and asked plenty of questions. Madison spent nearly 15 minutes explaining how unfair everything was. Then the officer came over to me. I handed him a folder. Inside were photographs of every destroyed mailbox, receipts, permits, inspection records, and documentation showing the installation complied with applicable requirements. He spent several minutes reviewing everything. Then he walked back toward the damaged SUV. Madison was still talking when he interrupted her. "Ma'am, based on what I've reviewed, this structure appears compliant." "Compliant?" she repeated. "It destroyed my vehicle." "Your vehicle struck a stationary object." The silence that followed was almost beautiful. Not because I enjoyed seeing somebody embarrassed, but because for the first time somebody in authority wasn't buying the story she wanted to sell. Eventually, the officer issued a citation for careless driving and arranged for a tow truck. As the SUV disappeared down the road, Walter shuffled over from his driveway, carrying a cup of coffee. He stared at the mailbox for a moment. "Looks fine to me." Then he took a sip and walked away. A few days later, the repair estimate arrived. Word spread fast, because neighborhoods are basically small towns pretending not to be. The damage exceeded $7,000. Her insurance company wasn't thrilled. Apparently, repeatedly colliding with fixed objects doesn't inspire confidence in underwriters. For the first time since moving into the neighborhood, Madison seemed noticeably quieter. I thought maybe the whole ordeal was finally over. I was wrong. 2 weeks later, on a bright Saturday afternoon, I was working in my garage when I heard another impact. Not as loud as the first one, but close. My eyes closed immediately because somehow I already knew exactly what had happened. Outside, Brooke's SUV sat a few feet from the mailbox with a crushed front corner and a deployed airbag. I actually laughed. Not because anybody got hurt. Nobody did. But because the sheer absurdity of the situation was impossible to ignore. 2 sisters. 2 SUVs. Same mailbox. Same result. Brooke climbed out looking horrified. "Are you kidding me?" she shouted. Walter, who somehow appeared whenever chaos occurred, looked over from his lawn chair and replied before I could speak. "Apparently not." By that evening, the entire neighborhood was talking about it. Pictures circulated. Stories spread. At the next homeowners association meeting, the Hartwell sisters became the unofficial topic of discussion. Nobody said much directly, but every time someone mentioned safe driving or property damage, people suddenly became fascinated by their notepads. The sisters hated every second of it, and that humiliation turned out to be far more painful than the repair bills. The weeks that followed were strangely quiet, at least on the surface. Nobody hit my mailbox. Nobody screamed across property lines. Nobody threatened lawsuits. But there was a tension hanging over the neighborhood that everybody could feel. Every time the Hartwell sisters drove past my house, they slowed down. Every time I stepped outside, they suddenly found something fascinating to look at in the opposite direction. It was the kind of silence that comes after a storm when everyone is waiting to see whether another one is coming. The next move finally arrived in the form of a certified letter. I opened it at my kitchen table and almost laughed before I finished the first page. Their attorney was demanding that I remove the mailbox structure immediately. According to the letter, it represented an unreasonable hazard and posed a danger to the community. I read it twice just to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding it. The same people who had destroyed 5 mailboxes and crashed 2 SUVs were now arguing that the stationary object was the problem. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. Then I remembered every soaked document, every broken post, every dollar I'd spent replacing property that should never have been damaged in the first place. So instead of arguing, I did something much simpler. I gathered every invoice, every receipt, every repair bill, every photograph, and every piece of documentation from the previous several months. Then I added everything together. Replacement materials, installation costs, cleanup expenses, professional consultations, lost time. The total came to just over $1,200. Nothing life-changing, but enough to matter. I mailed them a formal demand for reimbursement. 30 days to pay. Otherwise, I'd file in small claims court and let a judge sort it out. A few neighbors later told me they nearly drove off the road laughing when they heard about it. The sisters had expected me to back down. Instead, they found themselves holding a bill. 3 days later, Madison showed up at my front door. Not with an attorney. Not with threats. Just herself. I opened the door, and for the first time since she'd moved into the neighborhood, she looked tired. Really tired. There were no designer sunglasses. No confident might. No performance. Just frustration. "You actually sent us a bill," she said. "You actually destroyed 5 mailboxes," I replied. We stood there for a second. Then she sighed. "You could have talked to us." I almost laughed at that. I had 5 opportunities. She didn't answer because we both knew it was true. The conversation wasn't dramatic. There was no movie-style speech. No shouting. In fact, what surprised me most was how normal it felt. For months, I had viewed the sisters as these larger-than-life neighborhood villains. Standing there on my porch, I suddenly realized they were just 2 people who had spent so long avoiding responsibility that accountability felt like a personal attack. Eventually, Madison looked down at the paperwork in her hand and said something I never expected to hear. "We should have handled this differently." It wasn't a full apology. Not yet. But it was probably the most honest sentence she'd spoken since moving next door. The reimbursement check arrived the following morning. Every penny. Along with it came a signed letter acknowledging responsibility for the previous damage. I honestly stared at that letter for several minutes because I'd convinced myself it would never happen. Around the same time, their insurance company apparently reached its own conclusions. Both sisters were required to complete defensive driving courses in order to maintain favorable coverage terms. The irony was almost too perfect. The neighborhood heard about that too, of course. Neighborhoods hear about everything. Walter claimed it was the funniest thing he'd witnessed in 20 years. Imagine paying thousands of dollars to learn how not to hit the same mailbox twice, he told me one afternoon. Actually, for times, I corrected him. 5 if we're counting all the earlier ones. He nearly spilled his coffee laughing. As summer turned into fall, life gradually returned to normal. The Hartwell sisters still lived next door. Their SUVs eventually got repaired. The neighborhood moved on to new topics. Somebody painted their house a controversial shade of blue. Somebody else built a shed without approval. The usual suburban drama. But one thing never changed. Every single time those sisters backed out of their driveway, they did it slowly, painfully slowly. They checked mirrors. They adjusted angles. They looked over their shoulders. Sometimes I'd be watering flowers out front and watch them maneuver with the concentration of airline pilots landing a jet in a thunderstorm. Not once did they come anywhere near that mailbox again. That's probably the part people expect me to celebrate. They expect me to say I won. They expect me to describe some glorious moment of revenge. But honestly, that's not what sticks with me all these years later. What I remember most is how avoidable the whole thing was. Nobody needed to lose thousands of dollars. Nobody needed insurance headaches. Nobody needed lawyers, citations, or embarrassment at community meetings. All it would have taken was one simple conversation after mailbox number 1. A knock on the door. A quick apology. Maybe even a $40 reimbursement. That's it. Problem solved. Instead, pride got involved. Ego got involved. And once people start defending their mistakes instead of admitting them, small problems have a funny way of becoming very expensive lessons. Every now and then somebody asks whether I would do it all over again. My answer usually surprises them. Yes, I would. Not because I enjoyed any of it, and certainly not because I wanted anyone's vehicle damaged. I'd do it again because eventually you reach a point where protecting your property and your peace of mind matters more than keeping everybody comfortable. Some people mistake patience for weakness. Some mistake politeness for permission. And occasionally life has a way of correcting that misunderstanding all by itself. The mailbox is still there today. Same location, same appearance, same quiet little spot beside the road. Most people drive past without noticing it, which is exactly how it should be. But every time I look at it, I'm reminded of a question I'd genuinely love to hear your thoughts on. If someone repeatedly damages your property, ignores every opportunity to make things right, and only changes after facing consequences, is that justice, or is it revenge wearing a nicer suit? Let me know what you think in the comments. Were the sisters treated fairly, or did I go too far? And if you've ever dealt with neighbors who seem determined to learn every lesson the hard way, share your story below. I'd love to read it. And if you enjoyed this one, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stick around for the next story because trust me, sometimes the quietest neighborhoods hide the craziest battles.